Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today a look at the IE900s from Sennheiser. You might already be aware that these are a new earphone that's only recently been released by Sennheiser, and they were kind enough to send me a pair for an early review. So thank you to Sennheiser, particularly because I'm very excited to share the IE900s with all of you. The IE900s retail for $1,300 US or about 2,100 Australian dollars. So they're a flagship earphone, but they're not one of the most expensive flagships on the market. And yet, as I'll talk about soon, I think they definitely perform at the level of even more expensive earphones. So in some ways this is great news. Now I know this is not an affordable earphone by any stretch for most people, but at the same time what it does mean is you can get absolute top tier performance without necessarily spending the absolute peak price tags. But I'll get into the details of performance, comparisons, stuff like that soon. Before that though, we should start by understanding what you get if you buy a pair of IE900s.
In the right place to move. In the right place for you. Always stay up all night. Watch the neon light. Touch your ones that go numb. Heart beats like a drum. Feed the fantasy. Give yourself to me. Stay in this moment, just hold on, hold on. We like tonight, babe, tomorrow it's gone. You in the moonlight is all that I want.
The IE900 use a single dynamic driver in this tiny little aluminium machined housing. In fact, I'm going to remove the cable so you can see just how small it is. So if I take off the cable and the tip, that's the size of the housing, so it's really, really tiny. Inside there is a single dynamic driver and it produces some truly wonderful sound. The size and shape of these housings make them both incredibly comfortable but also incredibly compact to carry, and the fact that they're made out of metal and then anodized also makes them very hard wearing. There's no paint to chip off, there's nothing really to abrade against anything. They've got a few sort of sharp edges on the faceplate, but there's nothing too major that's going to cause any problems with long-term use. Swinging back to the drivers for a moment, they're a 16 ohm 123 decibel sensitivity driver. So that does make them potentially prone to hiss on some devices. On everything I've tried them with, I've had no issues at all. And indeed, for some reason I've found in the past, and maybe I'm making this up, but I seem to find that dynamic drivers are less prone to hiss than balanced armatures, even when they've got very similar specs. So maybe that's why I've heard no hiss, or maybe I just don't have any devices prone to hiss. All I know is that they're very easy to drive and sound fantastic from everything I've tried them with. Of course, if you use something with a high output impedance, like a tube amp for instance, then you might find some variations in sound quality. But if you're using them with most devices, particularly solid state devices, with low output impedance, they sound magical from just about everything, as I'll describe soon. Before we get there though, let's talk a bit about the accessories, and then I'm going to talk about some of the technologies that make the IE900 special, before we talk about its sound quality, and also a comparison to the 64 Audio U12T. Inside the box for the IE900, you get a case. It's a hard case or a semi-hard case that zips up. Nothing fancy, nothing special, but it's a good size, protects the earphones well, has space to store a few tips, an extra cable. It's a perfect combination of utility and also looking the part for a premium sort of headphone. It's got the serial number and model stamped on the case, so it gives it a bit of an extra premium feel, but it's basically the same case as you get with much cheaper IEMs, just dressed up a bit to make it look and feel a bit more premium. And I have no trouble with that at all, because it's a good workable case. Moving on from the case, you also get 3 different cables, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So you get your regular 3.5mm single-ended cable, but you also get a 2.5mm balanced and a 4.4mm balanced, and I think that's absolutely fantastic. It gives you lots of versatility between different sorts of devices, and it means you're never likely to need to buy a replacement cable. because you've already got 3. If one of them breaks, you've still got 2 more. Speaking about replacement cables, if you are somebody that likes to buy aftermarket cables, there is one fly in the ointment here, and that is that the MMCX connectors they've used on the IE900 are actually recessed slightly. So most aftermarket MMCX cables are not going to fit. The MMCX socket inside the actual earphone is slightly concave, which means that the plug on the end of the cable has to be slightly convex, slightly more pointed or protruded than usual. So my super amazing, wonderful Ikigai cable from Aries Audio won't connect to the IE900s, which is such a shame because they'd be a match made in heaven, I think, but I can't make that connection. So do be aware of that. If you've got MMCX cables lying around, they're probably not going to fit the IE900. Now, I have heard some people complain about the cables that come with the IE900s, but I don't tend to agree. I think whilst they're not a sexy looking cable, they're really, really solid. They've got a good, soft sort of rubber feel to the outside. I think they look nice and subtle and discreet. I actually really like them. They feel quality. They look the part of being a sort of premium style, nicely finished headphone cable. But at the same time, they don't scream out anything ostentatious or draw too much attention to what you're listening to. So I like them. I'm a fan of them. They're not the greatest cable I've ever come across, but I think they're really, really fine. They're also incredibly comfortable to wear. The ear guides over the top here bend really nicely and hold their shape without being too stiff. And then the cable sits nicely with no sense of microphonics. So I think they're great cables. I give full credit to Sennheiser for these cables being, I think, a really good sort of fit for purpose designed cable. So no complaints here other than the fact it would have been nice to see a standard MMCX connector rather than the recessed one. Moving on from the cables, we've also got 2 different sets of tips. You get a set of 3 different silicone tips and 3 different foam tips. I say different meaning size, so you get small, medium and large in both silicone and in foam. One thing that's interesting about these tips is they've all got an interesting little kind of geometric venting system on the front of the tip, which I don't know if that's designed to do anything from an acoustic point of view or if it's just there as kind of a wax guard. As I'll talk about shortly, I have tried different tips and any eagle-eyed viewers will have already noticed that I don't have the stock tips on the IE900s, and that's going to tell you something, but we'll talk about the stock tips first and then we'll come around to aftermarket tips. So in addition to the stock tips having this kind of venting or wax guard at the opening of the tip, they've also got a little bit of foam inside. And what that's going to be doing is damping some of the treble slightly. What I found really interesting as I played around with removing that damping to see how they sounded with and without was that all 4 tips that I tried, so I tried the pair of small and the pair of medium silicones, in both cases the foam amounts in every tip was slightly different. So between left and right, there was always a significant difference between the 2 tips in terms of the thickness of the foam. And then also between the smalls and the mediums, the quantities were still different. So it almost seems a bit random, the size of these foam pieces. And I don't know if that's because there's different densities and it's being done somehow by weight and density of foam, or if just the cutting's really imprecise because it's a spongy kind of material. I'm not sure, but it was really interesting to see that an IEM of this level of precision and detail, the amount of damping in each tip is different. Now, I'm not going to suggest for a second that I could hear a difference between them. Certainly when I listened to it before I started playing with the foam, removing them and putting them back in, I had no sense that there was any difference. So it was purely a visual thing that I noticed, not an auditory thing that I noticed. But I thought it was interesting and I thought I'd share it. Part of my reason for removing the foam was that I was not quite convinced whether I liked the earphones in their stock setup with the stock tips. And so this leads me to my first kind of warning or caveat about the IE900s. I say first, it might be the only one actually. My warning about the IE900s is that you do need to make sure you get a good seal with these. They're going to be an IEM because of the expectations that you might have coming in to listen to these. They're an IEM that if you don't get the right fit, they're going to be underwhelming. They're not going to sound bad, but you're going to wonder what all the fuss is about. I certainly did. I listened to them and I thought, yeah, they're okay, but I really wasn't blown away. When I got the fit right though, that was a bit of a different story. So do be aware if you're trying these out, make sure you try a few different tips until you really hear what these are capable of. I dare say you'll know when you've got it right because I think you'll be pretty astounded by what you hear. Or at least if you're used to earphones at this level of performance, you'll hear it and go, yes, that's what I was expecting. So do make sure you choose the right tip. That might just be a matter of different sizes in the stock tips. It might mean going to an entirely different tip. For me, I have definitely found that whilst the stock tips are fine, I don't necessarily like the foam damping in them. I think it takes away something from the earphone, and I'm not a fan of treble. I'm quite treble sensitive generally, but what I've found is that with the damping in place, it just sucks a bit of the life out of the IE900. Whereas with the foam damping removed from the stock tips, or indeed using the spin fits that I've currently got on there, everything comes to life and it's an engaging and exciting listening experience. I can't say that I've tried the foam tips with the IE900s, so I can't comment on that because once I heard it with the spin fits, there was no going back for me. That was it. And so at this point, let me tell you a bit about what the technologies are that are making the IE900 so special. Sennheiser have two technologies baked into the IE900, obviously in addition to normal expected things like a really high quality driver, the beautifully machined housings, all of that I kind of consider as standard. But they've got a few things that go beyond standard. One of those is what Sennheiser are calling acoustic back volume. Now in Sennheiser's world, what that means is they've built a special little housing that contains the driver and means they've got very specific control over the volume of air behind the driver itself. That allows them to tightly control the way the mid-range and bass frequencies are presented by the driver, and the results of it are an incredibly linear bass and lower mid response that's really, really exceptional. It's worth mentioning that Sennheiser aren't the only ones to take into account the volume of air behind the driver. Many companies do that with the overall design of the housing that their drivers sit in, and therefore they control the volume and the shape purely by the machining of the driver. So Sennheiser aren't doing something unique and different to anybody else in regards to that back volume design, but at the same time, they're doing it in their own way, and it's part of what makes the IE900 special. I think the thing that really makes the IE900 special though is what they're calling the X3R. The X3R is a combination of 3 Helmholtz resonators. Now this is the same concept that was built into the HD800S to help pull back some of the treble. The way it works in the case of the IE900 is that there are little channels built into or machined into the housing between the front face of the driver and the end point where the sound comes out into your ear. So actually what happens is that these little paths come off you could call it the signal path or the sound path. So where the driver pushes the air into the nozzle, there are these 3 little paths that are carved in that space, and each of them is a slightly different volume. The idea of these 3 little paths is that they're basically going to grab and attenuate certain frequencies. So the excess energy in the treble is getting trapped at very specific frequencies by these 3 little chambers. The idea of doing that is that it pulls back on treble spikes, but still allows there to be extended and slightly enhanced treble. As I said earlier, I'm generally treble sensitive. I'm not a fan of overly trebly earphones, but I love what I hear from the IE900s to the point that, as I said before, I even removed the extra foam damping from their tips. So the treble is so good that I'm quite happily to go naked, nude, commando, whatever you want to call it, with the tips on the IE900s because the treble is just so clean and so smooth, but also so well extended and detailed. Another benefit of the X3R system, according to Sennheiser, is that it attenuates certain frequencies that are likely to mask our ability to hear other details in the music. I've talked about masking before on the channel, and it's the understanding that if a certain sound is louder, it's going to prevent us hearing other sounds that are softer. In musical playback, what that means is that by taming some of this treble, we can hear more of the detail and resolution that might be in the lower treble or into the mids or maybe even into the bass. Ultimately, the end result of removing these masking frequencies is a better insight into the rest of the music, and the IE900s do that beautifully. So having covered off all the technologies, the design approach, the accessories that you get, it's time to talk sound quality. And I've already given the game away on this that the IE900s sound amazing. They have this beautiful, smooth, detailed and resolving sound that's incredibly well extended, but never harsh. They have bass extension that is absolutely wonderful, and it's up there with some of the best planar magnetics that I've heard. The bass response is flat, it's linear, it gives a nice sense of punch when it's needed, but it's also fast and snappy too. As we move up into the mid-range, general mid-range quality is fantastic, it's smooth, it's resolving again. The only thing I'd probably say is it does get just a little bit touch light in terms of the weight in the mid-range. There is a little bit of mid-range suck out, and that can cause things to sound a little bit less meaty than they probably should at times. It's not in any way unenjoyable, and in fact it's actually the opposite. It makes everything engaging and exciting to listen to. But if you're looking for absolute realism, I do think that's the one place that the IE900s do err away from perfection a little bit. In all other ways, I think they absolutely are amazing, but that is just one little tiny mark against their name for me on the occasions that I'm looking for absolute realism. As I'll talk about more in a minute, it doesn't take away from them being incredibly enjoyable to listen to. Potentially one of the benefits of that bit of suck out in the mid-range is that the imaging and the soundstage size is also really excellent for an IEM. Listening to a track like Crossing by Yoshi Horikawa, you hear all of the space and the depth in the soundstage almost as well, if not as well, as some headphones. I'm not suggesting it's reaching HD800 or HD800S levels, but it's certainly up there with other good dynamic driver headphones and some planar magnetics that I've heard. In addition to that big soundstage with lots of width and fairly good depth, the imaging and separation of sounds from the IE900 is really excellent as well. But perhaps it does sometimes get just a little bit too excellent. And what I mean by that is that it can at times over-separate sounds a little bit, which again is not necessarily saying it's a bad thing or it's unenjoyable, but in terms of pure realism and sounding as natural as possible, I do think it occasionally steps slightly out of the bounds of realism and does over-enhance the sound slightly, but in a really good way. If you're looking for absolute realism and truth to source, the IE900 may not be quite perfect, even though it comes very, very close. On the other hand, if you're just looking for an amazing listening experience that's thoroughly enjoyable, then I think the IE900 is still absolutely excellent. Let me give you an example of a track to help put that somewhat into context. One of the tracks I used for testing the IE900s was I Love You But I Don't Know What to Say by Ryan Adams. This is a really nicely recorded track that's fairly kind of low key and allows you to hear lots of different instruments within the mix and their placements in the soundstage really well. Listening to it with the IE900s, you can clearly hear Ryan Adams' voice is front and center, really well focused. Interestingly, the drum kit is just behind him, but it's also slightly below him, so it gives you a nice sense of height as well. The sound of the piano has a nice richness and weight, and the kick bass from the drums has a really nice punch to it, but it never feels over-enhanced or kind of forced into the mix. It's right where it should be, but still has a great sense of punch and presence. So listening to a track like that, you're able to really listen through the music in a way that not a lot of IEMs can do. All the music is presented really coherently, so it's not like it pulls it apart and overdoes the separation. But at the same time, it pulls it apart enough that you can really kind of suss out where everything is in the mix. That's an example of a track where the IE900 does everything just right. But there are a few other tracks that I listen to, such as some of my Keb Mo test tracks, where I did occasionally feel like the IE900 just went a little bit too far, as I said, in a realism sense. It was still thoroughly enjoyable to listen to everything through, and I'm going to put that into more context in a second, but it didn't always match what I believe a certain performance would have sounded like if I was sitting there in front of the musicians. And so let me use a comparison now to explain why I think there is a difference between enjoyment and realism, and both are actually very valuable depending on what you're looking for. To explain that further and to put the IE900 into context, I'm going to use the 64 Audio U12T. The U12T are an amazing earphone that is technically really, really excellent. But it's also an earphone that I find I don't necessarily sit there feeling wowed that often, and yet if I stop and think about it, everything they're doing is technically close to perfection. After playing around a bit, I tend to use the U12T with the M20 filters, which is the bassiest filter. And as you'll see from the graph on screen, the bass from the M20 filter is fairly similar to what you get from the IE900, although it's got a bit more mid-bass hump and it rolls off a bit sooner. The reason I say it's fairly similar is that it kind of provides a level of extension that's getting close to what the IE900 provides. And so I used the M20 filter for my comparisons with the IE900 because it was a closer match sonically than the M15 filters on the U12T, which do tame the bass a little bit and also change the mid-range response a little bit as well. So with the 64 Audio U12T using the M20 filters up against the IE900s, what I found was as I've listened to the two, I've swung back and forth. Once I got the tips right on the IE900, I actually thought they were going to make the U12T redundant in my collection. And then I came back and listened to the U12T again and realised just how technically amazing they are. And so I've swung back and forth over and over again as to which one I would reach for as my preferred kind of daily IEM, if you like. And the honest answer is I still can't quite decide. The reason being that the IE900 makes everything sound amazing. With the U12T, it tends to make really great recordings sound utterly incredible, but the lesser recordings, it kind of reveals those lesser recordings. It doesn't enhance them in any way, whereas I found with the IE900, it had this little touch of enhancement that it gave to everything in a good way, that meant that even mediocre recordings still sounded incredible through the IE900. And that's both a good and a bad thing, depending on what you're looking for. So let me break down their individual sound signatures and overall characteristics to give you a bit more clarity on what I'm saying here. The overall sound signature of the 64 Audio U12T is a bit richer and smoother across the whole frequency range. They don't extend as deep in the bass, but through the mid-range, they've got more weight and richness, and that to me is the more realistic presentation across all different tracks that I've listened to. The IE900s do hit sweet spots from time to time, but in terms of feeling like I'm sitting in the room listening to what the actual singer would have sounded like live, the U12T does that more often. I can't stress enough, that doesn't make the IE900 less enjoyable. It's purely that if I'm thinking which sounds the most like I'm sitting in the room in terms of tonality, that's where the U12T wins. On the other hand, when you're listening to the bass quality, the IE900 bass is very, very difficult to beat. Not in quantity, because I think in quantity, the U12T's mid-bass hump means it does kind of feel like it's maybe not punching a bit harder, but it has a bit more weight to it. However, the cost of that is it's a bit slower in the bass, which is strange given it's a balanced armature design, but it does sound a bit slower because the bass weight is all coming in that mid-bass hump that it's got. Whereas in the case of the IE900, it's getting its bass weight from the fact that all bass frequencies right down into the sub-bass are really well and equally represented. So for me, the IE900 is easily the winner on bass reproduction. It's got speed, it's got resolution and quality, and it's still got good weight and punch. The U12T is a bit fuller sounding, but it's also a bit slower as a result. The U12T also produces an excellent soundstage, but it's not as expansive as the IE900. It's a more intimate overall presentation, and so what that means is that whilst everything is incredibly well separated, it's not over-separated in the way that it sometimes is with the IE900. Once again though, that doesn't necessarily mean that one is better or worse. If I want to hear a more realistic rendition of what I think the music would have sounded like in the room, once again for soundstage and image placement, I'm going to reach for the U12T. But if I want a more exciting and engaging and fun presentation, I'm going to reach for the IE900. So it really depends what you're looking for. Returning to that Ryan Adams track, I Love You But I Don't Know What to Say, the U12T produced a more realistic overall rendition, but it wasn't particularly exciting. Putting in the IE900, it was still very close to realistic, but it was also just a bit more exciting. It's kind of like, if you think about it from an imagery point of view, it's kind of like the U12T is taking a true-to-life photo of the situation, whereas the IE900 comes in and turns up the saturation and contrast just a tiny bit, and it's enough that when you look at it you go, wow, but it's not too much so that it ever gets fatiguing or boring or uninteresting. It's done with an incredibly deft hand by the people that have tuned it, and it results in a beautiful, beautiful sounding IEM that I wholeheartedly would recommend. As I said before, if you were looking for an earphone that's going to give you a true and honest representation of whatever you're listening to, be it the recording, be it the source, anything like that, I do think the U12T is the better reference piece. In most ways, not always, because the bass obviously is more reference from the IE900, but the overall total sonic presentation, I think the U12T is a little bit more realistic and lifelike. On the flip side though, if you're looking for an earphone that is going to make everything you listen to sound wonderful, then that's where I think the IE900 does come in. It's got that tiny bit of lightweightness, if that's such a word, in the upper mid-range, and that has both its pros and its cons in terms of bringing out a bit of extra breathiness and texture in vocals, but at the same time taking away from the sense of weight and body. So it is a slight trade-off, but I personally think it's one that I would be happy to pay over and over again. The bass reproduction is some of the best I have heard on anything anywhere. And in fact, the headphone that the IE900 most reminds me of is the HiFiMan Susvara, and that's extremely high praise. I'm not saying it's exactly the same as the Susvara. What I'm saying is that it performs on a level that reminds me and is reminiscent of the Susvara. In particular, its bass extension and the linearity of its bass, but also in the way it has a bit of excitement and articulation to the leading edge of notes, or transients if you want to call them that brings the music alive, gives it a sense of energy and a sense of engagement. Whether it's technically overdoing it slightly, I'm not entirely sure, and honestly, I don't really care because it just sounds so good that I'm happy to lap it up over and over again. Over the past couple of weeks, since I've had the IE900s, they have become the earphone, once I got the tips right, they have been the earphone that I've constantly wanted to go back and find a chance to listen to. They've niggled at me and said, find a time to listen again, try it with this device, have you listened to this track with it? It was just always in the back of my mind to come back and try them again because they're so exciting, so fun, and so great at what they do. They haven't quite knocked the U12T off the perch for me as an earphone that I will keep in my collection, but it came very close at one stage for me thinking that I was going to sell the U12T and keep the IE900 as my only flagship IEM. That's how good they are. So if you've heard a bit of hype from other reviewers, I do think on this occasion it's hype worth believing. The IE900 is a super comfortable, super compact, I think nicely understated and therefore beautifully physically designed IEM that also happens to sound wonderful and amazing if slightly enhanced from a truly realistic presentation. If you're in the market for a flagship IEM, I would absolutely recommend that you check out the IE900. Partly because it's cheaper than many of the other flagships on the market, but also because I think it's one of the best sounding IEMs that I've heard to date. I've been sitting on a review of the Unique Melody Mess 2 recently. I've got that in the can. I haven't yet edited it ready for release, but I'm going to say right now, I definitely prefer the IE900 to the Unique Melody Mess 2. And as I've already said, I do slightly find them more engaging and exciting than the U12T, despite the U12T having some technical edge in some areas. So they're a brilliant earphone. I can't recommend them highly enough. Do put them on the list if what I've said today is appealing to you and you're in the market at this level of the price categories. For now though, I'll leave you to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.